Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I'm just going to open the meeting for the first bit of the annual meeting. So first of all, to welcome you all here. It's really good to see you. The first meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee for Economy, Business Growth and Skills. Jen, can you tell us who's got apologies for absence?
Yeah, Councillor Brownridge, Councillor Yvonne Carty, Mark Hunter, Karen Garrido.
Thank you. So the first item on your agenda is to apologies and then to note the membership of the committee for this municipal year. We've been informed that Oldham are going to be, in fact, nominating an additional a substitute member for Councillor Brownridge, and she will be joining the committee at the next meeting. The next item of business is the appointment of the chair for this municipal year. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with your terms of reference now, but the chair for this committee, and indeed all the Overview and Scrutiny committees, has to be a member who is not of the same political party as the mayor. So first off, do we have any nominations for the position of chair, please?
Yes. Could I propose that Councillor Holly continue as chair for the forthcoming year?
Okay, is anyone going to second that for me?
Yeah, could I second that, please?
Do we have any further nominations for that? So shall we welcome Councillor Holly to the position of chair for this municipal year? Oh, he's outside.
Yeah, do you want him to come in?
Yeah, should we bring him in?
Yeah.
I'll just wait a few seconds. Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just there?
Whenever, yeah.
Okay. Right. First of all, thank you for nominating me and voting me to be chair of this year, and I shall try and do the role to the best of my ability as I did last year. So thank you. The next item on the agenda is the appointment of vice chair. Do we have any nominations for vice chair?
Yes, I'd like to nominate Councillor Karen Garrido from Salford. If I might, Chair, I'd just like to say a few words about her because she wasn't able to be here today. I've known Karen for the 3 years that I've been elected, and I know her very well as a chair when she was the ceremonial mayor and chaired our full council meetings, and she did that very objectively, very fairly, and very often with good humour as well. She was very well liked in that position, and she's somebody I've always got on very well with. She also, I spoke to her on Monday at a scrutiny committee that I chair, and she was actually quite looking forward to this meeting. So it's a big disappointment for her not to be here, and I would strongly recommend her to this committee. Thank you.
Seconded, please.
Thanks, Chair. I'd like to second Councillor Karen Garrido for this role.
I suppose we ought to take a vote. Do we take a vote? No?
And we ask if there's any further nominations.
Oh, sorry. Any further nominations? Vice chair. In that case, Karen is appointed as chair. And right, so the next thing on the agenda is the Members' Code of Conduct and the Annual Declaration of Interest form. Members should be reminded of their obligation under the GMCA Members' Code of Conduct, and you need to complete an annual Declaration of Interest form, which is in the pack, and this will be published on the GMCA website. Anything you want to add?
This just refers to you when you're acting in the capacity, in your GMCA capacity, and so it needs to be done in addition to your district declaration. So I'd be very grateful if you could complete that for us. Thank you.
The next thing on the agenda is the terms of reference, and it's to note the committee's terms of reference and to note the committee's proposed dates and times of future meetings. One of the things we've thought about in terms of the timing, we've actually moved the meeting back to 2:30, but that was because of a particular request. And I think that already today a few members have said it might be a bit more convenient to have it at 2 o'clock rather than at 2:30. Are we in agreement with that, to have the meetings at 2 o'clock rather than 2:30? Great, okay, so we will do that. I won't go through the actual dates, but they're all in the pack. And is there any questions that anybody wants to raise in regard to the terms of reference? In that case, we just note that and note the proposed dates of the meetings. And then we're on to then the ordinary business of the committee, having finished the annual meeting. Chair's announcement on urgent business, there is no urgent business. And then declaration of interest, specifically for this meeting. Any declaration of interest? Jude?
Jude Wells from Stockport. I just declare that I have a personal interest. My partner, Councillor John Taylor, is on the Airport Advisory Committee.
Thank you. And if you make sure the form is completed and sent to or given to Susan. Oh, sorry. Luke.
I'm also on the Manchester Airport Consultative Committee. I don't know if that's much of a problem, but worth noting.
Okay. And then the next thing is we've got the Manchester Airport Economic Impact as a Significant Asset. And it's a report of Charlie Cornish, but we've got today Tim Hawkins, who's going to present the report, and Sir Richard Lee is sure to support as well. And I'm sure we're going to have some interesting observations and comments. It's an excellent report.
Well, thank you for the invitation to come to the committee and present this. I thought I would take the paper as read rather than chew my way through it, but I did want to pull out 4 or 5 different points that I thought were worth dwelling on. I'm happy to take questions as I go through if that's relevant. First thing I wanted to point out is that growth at Manchester has been strong in the last 5 years. In fact, in the last 10 years, we've seen growth averaging at just about 6.6% since 2010, which is a margin greater than the average at other UK airports of 4.4. So we've seen 10 million passengers worth of growth from 17.8 to 27.8 million passengers, which compares, we think, favourably with other UK airports and other major airports around Europe. This growth in itself has generated benefits directly to Manchester and to the northwest economy. Nearly 3,500 jobs increase over the last 5 years. We now see a total of 71,000 jobs supported by Manchester across the northwest economy, with a total 4.6 billion in economic impact in terms of GVA. And that's the widest measure of GVA in terms of wider economic benefits, which is an increase in 60% over the last 4 years. And at a UK level, Manchester is generating a GVA benefit of nearly £8 billion. Some of this has been driven particularly by the new routes we've seen, new global connections that Manchester has achieved together with its city partners through the Manchester-China Forum, and just very recently through the recently established Manchester-India partnership, where we've been able to announce the start of a new service to Mumbai, beginning this autumn, and also in the last couple of weeks, a new service to Addis Ababa. So I think those are really trailblazing announcements for an airport like Manchester, providing direct global connectivity to the region. And this comes off the back of some very significant new routes that we've added over the last 3 to 4 years. Hong Kong, we're now providing a daily service to Hong Kong this year. Nearly 500,000 passengers have been on that service since it started. And the one that we particularly focus on when we talk about new long-haul routes has been the route to Beijing, where we did a study last year called the China Dividend, where we wanted to understand the impacts as a case study of a new route to a new market where one didn't previously exist. So we had a really clear before and after, and in the report you would have seen the sorts of benefits that we've seen stimulated in just a very short period of time. Nearly 200,000 passengers have been on that route already, but in terms of the wider benefits that supports, in terms of trade, investment, bringing students to the north and driving economic growth, we think those benefits are significant and a clear example of what's possible and what the potential of Manchester is over the next 10 to 20 years. And to support that, there's a section in the report that talks about the transformation programme that's currently underway. I'm sure many of you will have seen it or even experienced it in terms of some of the construction that's going on around the airport. It's certainly coming on very, very quickly, having been on site yesterday. That is there as £1 billion worth of investment from the group to support growth from where we are, which is at around 28 million passengers, through to 45 million passengers over the next 10 to 15 years. Elements of that programme will be complete. The first element will be complete, which is the new pier. That will be April next year, and then we'll be bringing on subsequent phases over the next few years. That investment and that construction effort is supporting at its peak 1,500 jobs on site and across the economy, 150 apprenticeships, which we think and we hope will leave a real legacy from the project across the region. We were very careful in the way that we specified the contracts for that. We wanted the vast majority of the supply chain to come from the region, and we've achieved it, we think, with 75% of our spend occurring within 30 miles of the airport. We've also wanted to make sure that it inspires the next generation, and we've had already 3,500 pupils on site seeing what we're doing and just trying to inspire them in terms of some of the STEM subjects that they do. As I said, that will support growth of the airport to 45 million passengers over the next 10 to 15 years, and that growth in present value terms we think is worth some 70 billion to the northwest economy in present value terms. And that comes from a combination of direct and indirect employment benefits, spend through supply chains, but also encompasses tourism effects and also impacts on supporting better productivity and economic output across the region. The important point to note here is that the growth of Manchester will deliver benefits of the order that I've talked about, but of a magnitude much greater than Heathrow expansion. So you would have seen in the press this week the press ahead by the government with a national policy statement for Heathrow expansion. Heathrow have been very busy and very dedicated to the cause in generating regional support for that project. And they will talk about that project and the benefits to, and I've heard it many times, benefits to the Northern Powerhouse, but I just wanted to stress and pause at this point just to emphasise that Manchester's own growth will generate benefits 6 times greater, we think, than that of Heathrow. So our focus, and we hope yours, will be on the policies and the priorities to support growth at Manchester rather than at Heathrow, because I know Heathrow are very keen to collect support from each and every region in the UK. That's not to say that we're opposed to Heathrow growth, but we support our own priorities rather than theirs, if I can put it that way. The reason we do that is because we want the airport to act as a global gateway, not just for the city and the northwest, but for the north as a whole. We think Manchester has that reach, that global reach that enables it to do that. The one strategic, I suppose, priority we are really focused on is improving access to the airport from right across the north to strengthen our catchment. At the moment, our analysis shows that only 3 million people can get by public transport to the airport within 2 hours. That is a very, very low by comparison with other UK and European airports. Particularly with east-west connectivity through Northern Powerhouse Rail, we see that number growing to around 10 million. So a trebling in the size of that catchment, as the catchment gets bigger and our ability to attract people from across the region grows, we will be able to attract more airlines to bring new services, particularly new long-haul services to the region. We think that will have a transformational effect on the impact of the airport on not just the city and the region, but the whole wider north. So that's where our focus is. We're pushing government and we're involved in discussions about the delivery of an HS2 and NPR station at the airport, connecting the airport in an integrated way, north, south and east and west. We think that'll have a transformational effect, and we're pushing government, as I said, to deliver and commit to that as a priority and commit to a timetable that will see it delivered. So those are the points I just wanted to pull out from the paper. Very happy to take questions or as you wish.
But before I throw up the questions, first of all, Sir Richard, do you want to add anything to that?
I think just one thing. It is touched on in the report in paragraph 5.5. And this relates to the enterprise zone and economic development activity that's taking place around the airport. The report here talks about stuff that is programmed to happen. In reality, actually, quite a lot of it is either happened or is happening. Currently now, Airport City South, which is largely logistics, is fully committed. There are no spare sites there anymore. In terms of Airport City North, there are at least 2 hotels that are committed and 2 more on their way. But some of you have seen an announcement, I think it's last week, from the Hook Group, that the Hook Group are going to relocate their headquarters there, and that's relocation, but they're talking about over 6,000 jobs on the site. Most of those jobs are new jobs because this is a rapidly expanding company. So it's not just stuff that's being talked about, it is stuff that's happening on the site.
Thank you. Just a couple of observations. First of all, thank you for that, the report and the detail in there. What I was absolutely astounded by was the growth potential. I was used there for donkey shows, but never realised what the growth potential was, and particularly when you compare it to what's happened with Heathrow. So that was very illuminating. And I'll throw it open for questions now, and then I'll come back with a couple at the end.
Okay.
But can I just, this is a public meeting, and if there's anything that's commercially sensitive, clearly Tim can't answer that in a public meeting. So just to put that on record, basically. So questions? Bob.
Tim, can I refer you to page 44, paragraph 6.3?
Bob, can you put your mic on?
Yeah. Most people don't have trouble hearing me. Sorry, Tim. Yeah, page 44, paragraph 6.3. I mean, you'll appreciate in the last few years, APD has become a massive percentage increase in tickets, and in fact, I mean, you get the ridiculous situation where a ticket to New York might be £200 and the APD is 120 or something like that. You talk about discussions ongoing without, again, sensitive information, but discussions ongoing about APD and liberalisation. Can you give us a bit more detail without?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's no problem with that at all. The reform of APD that we're looking for acknowledges that APD is, as a cash source for the government, pretty much locked in. I think there's a significant reluctance to let go of that. It's built into government finances. For that reason, and acknowledging that, where we have focused our efforts has been on what we term an APD holiday. So for new, particularly long-haul routes, this is where we've been focusing our messaging. For new long-haul routes, the government would use an introductory rate for the first few years where a new route is brought on by an airline. That will create strong incentives for airlines, and it will encourage and support in the initial period of introduction new services. So at the moment, the rates you talked about would be either zeroed out for the first few years, or there would be a tapering in. That would allow us to compete, at least for the first few years, on equal terms with most other European countries, and those are our competitors to attract new capacity. So we think that's an innovative and effectively a commercial approach to this, because the government won't be losing revenue, because you can't tax what you don't have, and that we that we focus on expanding overall and in time the tax base. So it should be positive for government, and it's about incentivising and inducing more activity, which then becomes taxed at a later date. We think this would be quite easily implementable. It wouldn't have an immediate cash upfront impact on the exchequer. So that's where we've been putting our efforts for APD lobbying.
Susan.
Thanks, Chair. I think in the introduction, Tim, it mentions that you're part of the Greater Manchester economy.
Yep.
And the Greater Manchester economy is certainly combined authority is very focused now on having an inclusive economy. And so when I looked at what you've described as your corporate responsibility activity, and particularly this MAG Connect work, there's a few pages that speak to that. It crossed my mind whether do you see yourself as one of the anchor institutions in this city region? Of course, you've just explained your reach is huge because this is big finance, and you talked about the reach being the whole of the north. But one of the things that's featuring now is this role of anchor institutions in the whole development of an inclusive growth way of an economy.
Yep.
And one of the things there, of course, is to, if you like, dashboard underneath GVA. You mentioned that in the introduction. You said you talked about the context of your GVA. So
Yep.
hope you don't mind me asking about that. Whether there's any thought, or it might already be done. Forgive me if it's already done, and I should know about it. Whether the airport sees itself as an anchor institution in all of this inclusive growth. Thank you.
Yeah. I would say that we do. I don't know whether the term anchor institution has any particular relevance, but if it's talking about sort of a permanence and a fixed commitment to that kind of thing, I would say definitely yes. I think MAG has had a long record of commitment to developing in a responsible way, in a socially responsible way. Perhaps focused a little bit too much here on the GVA rather than some of the wider measures, but on an annual basis we do report as part of our CSR annual report. It's part of our annual report in terms of our financial reports. We do report on a wide range of CSR measures in terms of across I suppose a 360-degree perspective about CSR. So social measures, environmental measures and economic. Looking at particularly at employment and the impact that we're having on people across the economy and across the region. So I can perhaps send you some further information if that would be useful, so you can see kind of the breadth of that activity. And MAG Connect is an initiative that we pursued to try and bring together and sort of consolidate a whole range of different activities that we had going on. I think to try and create more recognition, not just because we want to promote what we do, but actually that people understand what is available as much as anything. So that program has been in place, I think, for about 12 months now, but it represents some activities that were going on from before.
Kate, then Kevin.
Thank you, Chair. I've got 4 questions. Shall we do them all in one go? Yeah,
I'll scribble them there, yep.
On 3.7, you mentioned about 32 apprenticeships working with MAG. I wondered if you'd say a bit more about what are you doing to perhaps increase those numbers? Have you got targets, that kind of thing? 3.9, you mentioned 30% of the workforce volunteering. Can you just clarify that is 30% through the efforts of MAG rather than 30% of the workforce volunteering?
Yep.
4.2, 54% increase in Chinese interest in property. A lot of people, I think, are starting to have major concerns about Chinese investment. They've got this massive private debt to growth ratio, and it's getting extremely worrying, and people are panicking about them being the source of the next balloon bursting. Is that something you're concerned about? How might that affect investments? Have you had, considered the risks of that happening? If you'd explain a little bit more about that. And finally, on 5.3, you mention about your efforts to contracts being awarded locally.
Yep.
If you could just say a little bit more about how that is done, what sort of things that you're doing to make sure those contracts are awarded locally.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, just taking the apprenticeships one first. I have focused as an organisation on quality apprenticeships, and there's a good focus in there on technical skills and on engineering apprenticeships. So while you may see much bigger numbers from other organisations, that has been the focus of our work, to make sure that those people coming out are genuinely skilled through an apprenticeship programme. I talked about the 150 apprentices that we are taking through the transformation programme. So as we go through the construction programme, we are, as part of our resourcing and our procurement, making sure those commitments are met by the partners that we're working with to deliver the project. In terms of volunteering, the 30% does represent a MAG number. It's a target. I think the number is about 17% is at the moment. Yeah, 15%. So there's some sort of frenetic activity to get it to that number. It's going to take quite some effort to hit that target over the next couple of years. But that's an example of one of the targets that you'll see reported on in our annual CSR report. So we set ourselves targets, and then we report about whether we meet them. In addition to that, we do work with an airport community network, so other companies that are based on site, to encourage them to volunteer through a network that we create. Some of them don't have the scale, if you like, to develop volunteering programs and to be able to plan and reach out to people who need that kind of volunteering. So we try to provide that framework to them, and we provide a network where they can contribute time without having to get into the activity of planning it and resourcing it, if you understand what I mean, in terms of managing that program, which helps sort of lever up some of the activity that we have. So trying to use the fact that we are usually only about a quarter to 1/5 of the people on site, trying to use all the other companies that are on site to do some volunteering as well. In terms of Chinese investment, I think from our experience and from the partners that we're working with, particularly on Airport City, BCG, have those concerns. I think they have been a good partner in delivering some of the investments that Richard's talked about. Clearly, with any partner, we do need to manage risks, and the demise of Carillion has been one of those instances where we've had to manage that risk, but from another partner, and to find a way out of that. Richard, I don't know if there's anything that you want to say on.
I understand the concerns that people have, because the way it's often presented. I think it's the fear that there'll be overseas investors buying up property and leaving it empty in the way that's happened in parts of London. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is that people who've got developments they want to bring forward in the city always have to attract finance for it. And this is an increasing source of finance. It's still actually a relatively small part of the total finance of development within the city, but it is a new addition to where finance can be gained from. In terms of certainly residential properties, there are we have the opposite problem. We don't have any empty blocks of flats. All of them are full, and we haven't got enough of them. So actually, there's and that's including the Salford side of the River Irwell as well. So that raising development finance is still relatively difficult. You might not know it from the number of cranes around, but raising development finance is still relatively difficult. It's also, I think, in terms of development finance, difficult to know where the money comes from anyway. If you look at investment in commercial investment over the last complete year, 91% of that came from UK institutions. although the money came from UK institutions, you haven't a clue where they got the money from in the first place, because money for pension funds, insurance funds, and so on moves around the world.
Thank has a local focus to it. As I mentioned, the target that we are set ourselves and we are meeting is that 75% of the spend on MAN-TP is occurring within 30 miles of the airport. That was something that we negotiated through the contract with our lead contractor, Lang O'Rourke, and it's something that we monitor with them to make sure we're achieving it. So it's part of a contract, and it reflects the CSR strategy for the programme itself. So it was deliberate, and it was sort of programmed in from the beginning as part of our approach to procurement. So people didn't, if people didn't meet the thresholds that we set in terms of what we wanted to achieve as we went through the procurement process, they didn't get through to the next round. So by design, we've ended up with a contractor that is achieving what we want to achieve in terms of procurement, local procurement and employment. So there are targets as well for how we employ locally.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, just to clarify on the question about the Chinese interest and investment, I was talking about financial risk. So I understand the stuff about property, but Beijing is talking about deleveraging. They're trying to shrink, you know, the amount of private debt, and that's specifically what I was talking about, because you know, they are investing. I'm not an economist, but I kind of take an interest, and I was interested to know about if there are expectations of that inward investment from China, if their economy significantly changes, as there is a potential, what we were doing, what was happening here to protect Manchester from that, Greater Manchester, I should say.
So Richard.
Well, I think the scale of Chinese investment in the city is, if they were to seek to sell the totality of their investments and repatriate it, the impacts on the overall Manchester economy would be fairly marginal. It wouldn't be a serious risk. But it's also in terms of Chinese policy with regard to overseas investment, that first of all, that Manchester in particular is still seen as being quite a favoured place, following on from the presidential visit a couple of years ago, and a lot of that investment comes from Hong Kong rather than from mainland China, and Hong Kong is not subject to the same restrictions as mainland Chinese finances.
Thank you for that clarification. Can I just go back to the point on apprentices? I thought the number looked very small, actually, for an organisation the size of Manchester Airport. But as you explained, because of the engineering apprentices, that's a different sort of situation when obviously the construction side is different again. But given the potential growth going forwards, what would be your vision of how the level of apprenticeships can increase and perhaps get up to the sort of target which I think, you know, public and private sector organisations are trying to aspire to? You know, so the opportunity here I see in Manchester Airport is absolutely phenomenal. And that's what, you know, what I would be very keen upon, you know, to how apprenticeships and generally skills are sort of increased within the working population. And Manchester Airport, you know, is at the leading edge, and it'd be just a great example of how apprenticeship really can work.
Yeah. I think what's probably obscured by those numbers are the number of people that we do train in customer service, in terms of security, the number of people that we provide job skills to. We just don't badge them as apprentices. I think other organisations would give people retail apprenticeships, customer service apprenticeships. I think we probably do that more on the job than perhaps other organisations would do, and then term it an apprenticeship. One area where we have not been able to make any progress to date is the Apprenticeship Levy, and using that as, you know, although we are subject to it, we are finding it almost impossible to access that in a way that would support the creation of apprenticeships, or we could use to support the training that we're already doing for staff, customer service, and frontline security people. We just can't really break into that because of the way we train people. So there is a great deal of training, and I think a great deal of skilling going on within the company that's not badged as apprenticeships. That said, I think we probably are hungry to do more, and it is something that we are looking at the moment as part of our CSR strategy as to what an ambitious target would look like for apprenticeships, and then the programme that sits underneath that. The Airport Academy does also play a really important role in bringing people from out of work and into work, and we are investing in a new facility soon to be commissioned within the public transport interchange, which will bring together the Aerozone facility for school children as an educational facility with the academy and what we do in the academy already. So I think there's some very good work going on. But I think the headline numbers do look low. I would probably say that there's a lot more going on underneath that we should be proud about.
That was very helpful. Kevin.
The report paints a very visionary and exciting picture of the development of the airport, but I just wondered, do you have analysts who can assess the impact of the airport's development on climate change?
That's not something we would do internally. We would tend to outsource that and use external companies to understand that. Having said that, we do set clear targets for our carbon emissions, and we will want one of the first airports in the UK to be sort of accredited as carbon neutral. We've addressed our carbon emissions in a variety of different ways, as we say in the report. And we would tend to provide them with an inventory of our emissions. I mean, we would tend to provide external auditors with an inventory of our emissions. They will audit those and verify those for us. But we would work with partners to understand the other opportunities to reduce our impacts.
Yeah, I noted in the report that the establishment, as it were, is carbon neutral, but I'm thinking of the implications of increased air travel on the climate. And it's obviously a concern to us all because it is the major danger to us as a society and as a world. So, as a company, do you do any work on looking at that at all?
We do. A colleague, the lead on CSR, is very active in a UK industry partnership called Sustainable Aviation, which brings together airlines, aeronautics companies, airframe manufacturers, engine manufacturers, and airports to understand what opportunities there are to reduce emissions over the long run, understand what the picture for sort of technological research means when you implement it and you roll it forward over the next 50 years, and how that comes together with the need to reduce the overall level of carbon emissions. The way government has looked at this is in two scenarios. One is where there is a trading mechanism between sectors globally, which provides aviation with the ability to grow, but in a way that requires other sectors to reduce their emissions to provide that space within an overall cap. And that is the one, in policy terms, the UK government is pursuing with ICAO, the global aviation regulator, and other governments. The other more restrictive version of that, if that cannot be delivered, or there's no confidence that can be delivered, is looking at sector caps. I was going to say within the EU, but we might not be part of that. But within the UK, and understanding what each sector needs to achieve in the UK to achieve the UK's targets. But that's obviously a lot more restrictive than taking a global approach and looking at offsetting emissions in one part to allow growth in the other. But we're very cognizant of that there isn't an unlimited ability for all sectors to grow, there needs to be some sort of compensation or compensatory offset to achieve growth over the long run. But given the priority for economic growth, and we do need to sort of identify the solution that will allow that rather than constrain it.
Sir Richard.
A couple of comments, really. One is that although Tim talked about passenger growth, if you look at aircraft movements, you've not had the same increase in aircraft movements. So this is a larger number of people, basically, and a lot of this is in larger, more efficient planes rather than necessarily more planes. And planes themselves, partly, largely driven by the industry, are getting far more fuel efficient, looking at lighter materials, more efficient engines and so on, because basically it makes flights more viable. So a lot of that technological change is being driven by the market as much as anything else. There are also a small number of things that airport can do to improve aviation emissions very, very locally, and indeed MAN-TP ought to achieve some of that. Is that all the work that's taking place not on the terminal but on the aprons and so on ought to make the movement of planes on the airfield far more efficient and reduce emissions. And similarly, if you make sure that you don't have delays in takeoff, and so you don't have planes sitting on the tarmac or going round in circles above the tarmac, you can minimise emissions through that. So there are some airfield management issues that can be done to improve the emission position.
Chris.
Yes, thank you for the report. It's very positive, the view of Manchester Airport and going forward. And I agree entirely with your view that access to the airport needs to be improved vastly, because with HS2 it'll be quicker to get to the airport from somewhere in the Midlands than it will be from somewhere in Oldham or Bury or Rochdale. And until that's addressed, employment opportunities won't be accessible for residents within that area of the conurbation. The report states about the growth and GVA. Is it possible for any future report to specify the districts and the areas which are accessing the employment and procurement within the airport?
Yes, I can provide that information to you by reply, really. We have the employment distribution. We know how many people work in each area of Manchester, so we can provide that to you.
That'll be very interesting, actually. So if you can send that into Susan, then she can distribute it to the members of the committee. Sir Richard.
It's something that I've discussed with Charlie Cornish, which is that with the growth in jobs at the airport, but on the airport site, then transport access to the airport becomes ever more pressing. Particularly given the hours, certain hours of the day that having, we already got trams that are now starting at 3 o'clock in the morning, I think, rather than what happens elsewhere. But I think the airport itself will have to do something about improving transport links from other parts of the conurbation. It becomes a win-win, basically, to improve access to the jobs from other parts of the conurbation, but they will need people from other parts of the conurbation to fill the jobs.
Tanya.
Thank you, Chair. Again, thank you for the informative and exciting report. I've got one question. On page 38, it states that the airport has the enterprise zone status, and of course we know enterprise and innovation are very closely connected, and of course we've got 3 universities in Greater Manchester Metropolitan and Salford universities. I was just wondering how I couldn't see that much information about utilizing those assets for the development, and especially in as an enterprise zone state, as an enterprise zone.
Could you give me the paragraph reference so I don't have your...
It's sorry, it's 38, page 38, 331, the last one, 4.
Oh, I see, yes. point, I would appreciate if that's okay. Richard, I don't know whether you can help me out on this one. I'm not particularly familiar with enterprise zones and how they operate.
Well, it was something that I talked about because there is slightly more detail later in the report at 5.5, which talks about the sort of investment that's taking place, which I sort of talked about. But the specific question about engagement with the universities, I mean, there, as I think Tim indicated earlier around climate change, there are areas of the airport's own activity where they will engage with the universities on research activities, sometimes commissioned from the airport. In terms of the enterprise zone, is that the airport's role is solely of basically as a developer of the airport zone. It's not directly involved in what goes on within the businesses within the enterprise zone, although some of them will have their own university links.
Sorry, any more questions?
Can I just add to
Yes,
that? Rich has just given me a lead into something which I can talk, which is with Manchester Metropolitan, which is a piece of work that we are scoping with them at the moment. Is to understand people's attitudes to aircraft noise and how those have evolved over time, and the societal impacts of aircraft noise on people living near airports. So I think that comes from a long-standing relationship between the airport and the university, and it's something that we're doing right now.
In the recommendations, which says the committee has recommended to support Manchester Airport Group in its lobbying with government around high-speed rail connectivity into the airport, HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail, and aviation policy issues, including air passenger duty, which you've answered Bob's question. That was a good answer, actually. Because I thought we were talking about having differential rates like Northern Ireland want to have, in the same, bring it into line with ERA and what the Scottish government are trying to do. So that was an interesting thing. I couldn't rationalise how you could do that within England and Wales. But the other thing you've got in here is bilateral aviation agreements. Yeah. I'm not sure what we can do in terms of supporting you on that. I'm sure we will support you, but perhaps you could explain what sort of support you want from us and what you actually mean by the development of these bilateral aviation arrangements.
So the UK has a whole range of aviation agreements that allow airlines from different countries to fly between those different countries. A lot of our aviation agreements are tied up with our membership of the EU. So the ability to fly between the UK and any EU country is captured within effectively a single aviation market. Unfettered access and capacity and pricing, those things were liberalised back in the 1990s. The UK also has aviation agreements with other countries around the world through its membership of the EU. So the EU negotiates or has negotiated with countries, the US and with Canada. So we have an open skies agreement with the US by virtue of our membership of the EU. As we leave the EU, we will need to renegotiate those agreements, and those negotiations are ongoing at the moment. There's hopefully a final meeting of the US-UK bilateral negotiations next week. And then the UK has its own direct relationships with countries where the EU hasn't taken the mandate for those negotiations. Where we have made some progress in recent times, as an example, the relationship with the Chinese government, we were able to secure an increase in the number of permitted weekly flights between the UK and China from 100 to 150 last year, which has been ring-fenced. The 50 increase has been ring-fenced for regional airports, which will provide us with scope for growth, and that's an example of where we've been able to make some positive progress, sort of separate from London. I think at the moment there are no live examples of where we need to lobby to maintain or secure a sort of favourable status. And if thinking of it the other way round, in the past there has been a danger that to secure the right outcome for the London airports, the regional airports have been used or their interests have been compromised. So we are alert to that, and that somehow access is somehow sort of compromised, or the ability to fly in and out of Manchester or other UK airports is compromised to achieve something around London. It's quite hard to be precise or specific about it, but we know that risk exists, so we're alert to it all the time, and we will be sure to let you know if we need your support to lobby on something like that.
Well, I'm sure you will have the support of this committee. I mean, obviously we've got a fantastic asset here in Greater Manchester, and the opportunities for growing the airport, growing, if you like, the business, growing inward trade, inward investment is absolutely so important for this region to actually develop in the way in which it should develop. I'm going to allow one more question, and that's from Bob, and then we'll move onwards.
Sorry, thanks, Chair. Yeah, actually, to take on what Councillor Holly said, I mean, the last 10 or 15 years, despite us being members of the EU, people like Frankfurt and Schiphol have been really aggressive in this creation of a hub. I mean, it's a dogfight out there, isn't it, to establish yourself. And I just wonder, are we ready for it when the EU ceases? Because if the fight was bad before when we were all friends, it's going to be a bit more aggressive when we become not so friendly.
I would say our investment in the transformation programme at Manchester is an investment in our competitive position. It's trying to maintain a competitive advantage. It's partly to provide more capacity, but it's also to be there and provide better service for airlines and for passengers. And by doing that, we think we'll provide better value, both to passengers and to airlines. So our level of our attractiveness should be protected. But I think it also goes to the discussion we were having earlier about APD, that if we want to compete with a 10-ton boulder on our back, you know, in terms of APD, then that's going to be a lot harder, and that's part of the dialogue with government about to put ourselves in the strongest possible position after we've left the EU to attract new, particularly long-haul connections to global markets. The outward-facing Britain part of this is incompatible with such heavy taxation, such kind of at European levels, so out of proportion to any other taxation any other European country has. The government wants one thing, but it also wants the other, and we're trying to get it to recognise that those are just incompatible. That if we want that kind of connectivity, then we need to bring airlines here to provide it. That's the level we're competing at, is a European one, not, to your point about UK, within the UK, between Scotland and Northern Ireland and England and Wales. That's not the level of competition between airports. It's about winning that competition at a European level.
Sir Richard.
Well, the two airports mentioned, Schiphol and Frankfurt, are also, their mode of operation is actually driven by airlines rather than the airports, in that they both have legacy carriers, Lufthansa at one and KLM at the other. And by and large, the model of a hub airport is dependent on having that sort of carrier. The aviation industry has changed quite radically over the last 15 years, and you will see actually the growth that is taking place doesn't come from those legacy carriers. It comes from low cost and disruptive carriers like Etihad, Emirates and so on. And actually it's where Manchester has strength, is the very large number of airlines that are using the airport rather than dependency on a single, effectively, Schiphol is dependent on a single airline.
Can I just sort of add to that, which is the relationships with airlines is something that the group, I think, has successfully transported across its airports, and two examples serve that. I think Jet2 started operating at Stansted, having been operating at other group airports last year, and has doubled its capacity at Stansted in this summer. It's entered that market and really grown. I think that's borne out of its good relationships with us at the group level. And today, Emirates are starting their first service ever from Stansted, a daily service to Dubai and on, which we are enormously proud of. And I think that comes from the relationships that Richard's talking about, is that we're able to develop those, build a level of trust and sort of commercial confidence with airlines, and then take those across the group. So I think today's launch hugely significant for Stansted, breaking into a sort of global market, has sort of been born out of its part of being part of MAG.
It's easy to forget, I suppose, that apart from Manchester, which we focused on, with your ownership of East Midlands and Stansted, our councils benefit from the profitability of the organisation and the dividend streams that we get from the organisation. So it's not just Manchester Airport, it's the group, which is excellent. So in that case, can we note the recommendations in the report, and we will give you whatever support we can.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you for the presentation. Excellent. In Greater Manchester, Alan Harding is going to talk to this report.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. This is very much an information item which is intended to support the work of the Task and Finish Group on a fair economy and fair wages, which is kicking off its work at the present. It's a summary of a whole load of data walloping, which colleagues in the Greater Manchester Authority and in their previous guise as New Economy have done over the last few years. There was a very big piece of work done by New Economy in 2015-16, which reported on data running to 2014 as part of the annual exercise of updating that, some of that data at least, through the labour market and skills review. There's items in the report which update us a little bit. It also reports on some of the more recent policy initiatives which are ongoing, linked to the issue of low pay. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to attempt what is effectively a summary of a load of information which was summarised in a summary which you can find. So this is the summary of the summary of the summary, if you know what I mean. I ought to contextualise this by saying that the UK's issue with low pay is not UK specific. In many ways, we're dealing with a developed world set of issues in two senses, really. One is the ongoing restructuring of labour markets and the disappearance of the missing middle range of jobs, if you like, particularly in manufacturing, which is tending to drive growth in lower and higher value activities in the service sector. That makes an enormous difference to pay differentials. And the second thing, which we're all having to live with to different degrees, is the extent to which the post-crash economy has tended to generate jobs at the lower end of the income distribution rather than at the higher end. If you put those two things together, the Greater Manchester position, I think, is it's not disastrous, and it could be improved, shall we say. The issue that faces us is how does something like a combined authority with limited levers over pay levels actually wield influence in the most intelligent way. If I can just take you through some of the headline findings. I think probably most of these won't be surprising. UK real inflation-adjusted pay has been falling certainly over the 2007 to 14 period. We're in a low productivity, low wage inflation situation. We continue to be in that. Interesting little nuance there, I thought, was that there were sharper wage reductions for the bottom 20% of paid workers. Sharper reductions there than there were for the 10% lower paid. I think if we were scratching around for an explanation of that, it's got something to do with statutory minimum wages providing a floor for wages and to some extent becoming a guide to low pay. rather than a floor beyond which they shouldn't fall. We could do more analysis of that to get below the surface of it. Equally, what we are finding in Greater Manchester and in the country as a whole is that it's the recent pattern of job creation has tended to favour the traditionally lower paid sectors. So there's reference in there to things like retail, accommodation and food services, health and social work, care, arts, entertainments, traditionally lower paid sectors. Their importance to Greater Manchester's economy has grown by 5% over the 2014 period, and it's grown faster than it has in the UK as a whole. There's not a great deal of difference, though, it has to be said, between the national picture and the Greater Manchester picture. In fact, if anything, in the very recent period, there are some signs that GM is performing better in some respects. So again, one thing which we shouldn't take as necessarily as an indication of a long-term trend, but the most recent data on earnings suggests that GM residents continue to earn £1,400 a year less than the UK average. However, there's been a 4% rise in wages in GM over the last recorded year compared to less than 3% in the UK. That doesn't necessarily mean that there hasn't been an increase in low-paid work, but it does suggest that there may have been a higher than average increase in the higher end of the labour market, which would be good news if it's continued. Just a few comments about the way in which a combined authority can respond to the challenges of low pay. Clearly, the levers that we directly control are relatively limited. By the same token, the Greater Manchester Strategy, which pays a lot more attention to issues of job quality and inclusive growth, that is meant to be a strategy for Greater Manchester as a whole. So we've had reference in the previous session about the importance of anchor institutions. The GMS is very much seen as something which all organisations and interests in Greater Manchester are asked to contribute to. That's easily said. The challenge is making it a reality. But there are a number of initiatives ongoing which try to do that. The things that are flagged up in the paper is that as of the end of last year, the GMCA was accredited as a living wage employer by the Living Wage Foundation. In addition to that, we are going through a process of agreeing a GM employer charter with as many employers as we can get to sign up to a whole range of things around wages, remuneration, wage inequalities, contracting procedures, recruitment and progression of workers. There are various papers that I can draw your attention to on that. And I think the committee's already had some contact with the officers who are leading on that. But we can introduce you to that work. In terms of new steps which the combined authority are taking on both on the analytic side and on the policy development side, as part of the refreshed Greater Manchester Strategy and making sure that we measure our impact more effectively, there is a commitment to produce a new annual State of Greater Manchester report, which will take more seriously the distribution of benefits that accrue to different areas of Greater Manchester, as well as different social, ethnic and gender groups. That's going to be a feature of that strand of work. The GMCA has also signed up to fulfil the obligations of the equality duty. It didn't have to. It undertook to do that voluntarily. But as part of that equality duty, it's asked to report on certain priorities in relation to equalities, and it would be perfectly legitimate to consider wages within that set of issues if that's what we prefer to do. The final couple of things I'd mention is that you'll probably know that Greater Manchester has been approved as one of the pathfinders or the trailblazers for a local industrial strategy. We're currently hard at work on the evidence base for that and a whole series of consultations about what a GM industrial strategy would look like. There is a real challenge, I think, in terms of responding to issues of low pay through a local industrial strategy. one of the pieces of work that we are proposing to do is to understand what's called in the trade the long tail of low productivity firms. In layperson's language, they are things like the retail sector, the care sector, and thinking through the implications of what an organisation like ours, leading a family of organisations such as exist in GM, can actually begin to do about some of those lower paid sectors and what policies might help. The final thing is relates to that bigger family of organisations. We've already had reference to anchor institutions. The Combined Authority, together with partners at the universities in Manchester, are beginning to develop a strategy for thinking about the way in which anchor institutions collectively face some of the bigger issues that the conurbation faces. I anticipate that pay and pay differentials will be an important part of that.
Thank you for the report. Before I throw out for questions, Kate, as chair of the Task and Finish Group, is there anything you want to observe on that or add to that? I mean, I guess you'll have questions anyway.
I do have questions, and I'm probably not prepared enough yet to talk too much about the task and finish and where we're up to, because we've just had a very general kind of look. We're only just at the stage really of trying to narrow it down and think about, you know, what direction we want to take it in. We've talked a little bit about focusing in on the possible social value of the employers' charter. But that's kind of where we're up to at the moment. So I think our next discussion, when we get together, we'll be narrowing it down and focusing it, and perhaps have something to bring back to this committee at that stage.
That's fully reasonable. So, questions then? Susan first, then Kate.
Thanks, Chair. I want to hone in on that phrase, leading a family of organisations, but I want to stick actually to the 10 local authorities. So there is going to be this reporting the state of Greater Manchester. I understand that, thank you. But thinking about the local councils, it's what leadership can go on there, in the sense that, you know, I've had a look at a lot of different reporting, and there is still a lot of honing in on gross value added. And then the other thing I tend to find is unemployment statistics go in various different reports to scrutiny committees and so on. But and perhaps it's about sharing within the local authorities. But is there a way to provide more leadership so that the local authorities are doing things like, I'm thinking about what would the dashboard be below GVA. So it would absolutely be about showing, for example, the statistics on employment within those 7 sectors of low pay. That's what I call them. You listed them. And so it's how can we get the councils that sit at the GMCA to themselves, because it's always about the work that continues to go on within the local councils. How can they start to do reporting and hone in more on what we know the dashboard needs to be for an inclusive economy, when they're also looking at in their local areas a whole approach to an inclusive economy, and that it won't just be happening in Greater Manchester through the state of the Greater Manchester report. Have I formed that question okay there? Is that fairly honed in? So it is very much about the councils and their work.
Okay, you formed the question very well. I'm not sure I have an answer to it. The challenge that we have within the Combined Authority is to translate the refreshed Greater Manchester strategy into something meaningful that we can measure, which is partly measuring change in the outside world that we're trying to influence, and partly trying to get a grip on whether our actions are actually leading to the changes. So that in itself is a very complex data collection, data definition exercise. What I can tell you is that in trying to do that, what we are increasingly doing is setting a whole range of indicators which are relevant to the particular aspiration that's covered in a particular priority area. We are entirely alive to some of the criticisms which are increasingly voiced about the limitations of GVA as the dominant measure of economic change. Productivity measures are slightly better in that they give you GVA by person or by person in work. So some of the work we'll be doing is trying to look under the skin of Greater Manchester's particular version of the productivity puzzle, as it's being called. But I think you're quite right that going alongside that, if we are thinking about issues of inclusive growth, are things like employment rates, for example, and access to jobs and the way they are improved through educational qualifications, for example, levels of health. So we are in the process of defining a whole range of measures which are relevant to the particular tasks which GMCA individual local authorities have agreed to support at the Greater Manchester scale. We would hope that would have an effect also on the way in which data is prepared and collected at local authority level. Although, of course, individual local authorities are free to collect the data that they wish to against their own set of priorities.
Yes, Richard.
It's probably not about the data collection per se, because implied in the question is what anchor institutions, which you talked about previously, do about it. And I think that is down to each individual local authority, but clearly that what you do about recruitment, what you do in terms of procurement and commissioning of services, what you do in terms of the not just pay levels for your own workforce, but development of your own workforce is part of it. Part of the discussions you have with the partners that you work with, and there are a whole range of activities that a local authority can undertake that have an impact on the level of inclusivity we've got. Now, I don't know I know what it is in Manchester, but I don't know what it is in other local authorities, and I guess that's for you to find out individually. So also, I can say that there are elements of our policy in Manchester on ethical procurement, which were very much driven by scrutiny process, indeed part of it by Councillor Rates when he chaired a task and finishing group on minimum wage. So all I'll say is go and find out in your own authority, and if you don't like it, do something about it.
Sam.
Just going to add on the State of GM report, we will be looking at not just the issues of GVA and productivity, we will be looking at each of the 10 Greater Manchester Strategy priority areas and looking at each of those against the kind of various domains of inclusion. So trying to break down the issues by kind of subsets of Greater Manchester's kind of population and say kind of different aspects of the inclusion agenda for each of the 10 Greater Manchester priority areas. So hopefully it will, and we'll obviously bring that back to scrutiny, but hopefully it will actually be quite a rich data report in terms of trying to unpack some of these issues.
Susan, great question. Are you happy with the response?
Yes, thank you very much.
Kate next, and then Luke.
Thank you. A couple of points. The first one's perhaps slightly pedantic, but there is a reason behind it. Sorry, 1.2. 1.3, you mentioned about the living wage, and it just threw me a bit. I realised looking at the numbers you were talking about the foundation living wage, I would just request, rather than throw me into confusion and onto Google to try and get the numbers, can you just make it clear that it's the foundation living wage that you're talking about in the report? The other point was just about, you mentioned about the, on 1.2, the low pay in GM, and it was found to be closely related to low productivity. And it just got me thinking about that relationship between the two. And my understanding about low productivity is a lot to do with low investment. And, you know, how much can we influence that to try and improve low pay? Or is there any way of trying to improve productivity in order to improve the low pay? Or do we just ignore that and look for other ways of improving pay? Just if you just say a little bit more about how you see the association, the link between low pay and productivity, and how much we can do about it as a GM. Thank you.
So I don't want to get into a masterclass about the measures of productivity, because we might be here all day. The link is very, you're right, there's something about investment in this, particularly manufacturing, which is the most obvious connection between, you know, levels of productivity, output. The dilemma there, of course, is that manufacturing has been pretty successful in raising its productivity. GVA productivity is good within the manufacturing sector, and it employs very much fewer workers. The challenges are very different in the service sector, and productivity measures, frankly, are not particularly brilliant for services. So that's one of the things we want to look at when we're preparing the evidence for the local industrial strategy. But there is a general relationship between levels of investment, not just in things like physical plant, but in training, managerial, technical competence. So there's a whole range of skill issues which are linked to productivity. And it's, you know, the other thing we put in the report is there's also a strong link to educational levels. So raising the educational and skill levels within all sectors, and particularly those lower productivity sectors, is something that we should think about aspirationally and think about the implications for what we do.
Let's go on.
Yeah, you just reminded me of something else I meant to ask, actually, about some of those low-paid people, and you were talking about their low skill level and the need for additional training. I wondered how easy is it for somebody who's in a low-paid job to access the training opportunities? Are the training opportunities there? Is there any issues about how they access them, or ways in which that could be improved? Thank you.
I'll ask Simon to come in on this if I may, but one of the things that the report, the research underlying the report found, which was very interesting, I thought, was the degree of churn in low-paid activities, which I think supports broader research which has been done about this. So there is a little bit of a myth which is in circulation about, you know, generations of people in families who never had any jobs. That's almost non-existent as far as I can see from the research that's actually been published. What actually happens is that people are in and out of poorly rewarded, poor quality, often temporary and insecure forms of work, and they cycle through those things. What the finding in the report suggested was that I think it was something like 36% of those people in a 15-month period that we measured actually ended up stayed in low-paid work. There is churn in lower-paid activity. Another finding was that people had to move jobs in order to improve their pay, rather than stay in jobs and get training. So my instinctive answer to that question is low-paid people in particular find training opportunities at a premium, and they respond in two ways. They either go to jobs which have got better prospects and will give them that training, or they cycle around the low-paid sectors by being in and out of work. But Simon, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, just really picking up on what Alan was saying, that was a key finding, that people escape low pay by moving job rather than progressing within their job in the main. The answer to the question about training opportunities is it'll depend on the employer, because obviously a lot of training is down to employers as whether they offer training or not, and also depend on the skill level of the individual. So there are certain statutory entitlements that people have to training up to level 2 qualifications, so broadly up to kind of what you would currently regard as GCSE level. So if you haven't got a GCSE English and Maths, there's certain statutory entitlements to training. But beyond level 2, there's very little public funding for training activity. There are things called adult learner loans. So if somebody wants to do a level 3 or level 4 qualification, they can access learner loans, but that is a loan which has to be repaid. And we've done some evidence about whether or not people's willingness to take up those loans and almost the reward or the additional salary they might expect from doing those loans, and some reluctance to take up loans. As one of the things we're talking to the government actually about at the moment is some additional flexibility in those loans, potentially, to see whether we can't get that flexibility to make those more beneficial to people to take up to try and solve this problem.
Thank you. Just going back to productivity for a second, which is something that I've been going on about from the start of this committee, really. And it's, you know, if you want to increase wealth for the country, therefore create, you know, if you like, the right sort of social structure in the country, the right sort of, you can increase more taxes of the right level of government expenditure, you need to improve productivity. But particularly in a service-based economy, how do you measure it properly? And that's why I struggle to get my mind around. And it's a good example was, years ago I was on the board of the Penn and Acute Trust, NHS Trust. And, you know, within the NHS, there was a view that productivity was decreasing there over a period of time. But again, within that area, and bearing in mind there are over 1 million people employed in the UK in the NHS, how do you measure productivity? And it's something that, you know, obviously it's an economic, if you like, theory and something that should be capable of measurement. But I just struggle, other than in manufacturing, where you can see with the right level of investment in machinery, how you can actually reduce labour costs against that. That I understand, but in the service sector, I think it's just so difficult. And I just wonder if you could just give a few words on that, perhaps.
You're absolutely right. So we should probably probably distinguish between private services and public services in this regard. I think it's slightly easier to look at profit and loss accounts in terms of private sector profitability. The problem with public service productivity is that traditionally the measure of output that was used was wages. So it was almost a circular argument. If wages were lower, your productivity was lower. There have been attempts by people a lot brighter than I am to try and think through this puzzle over the last few years. What I would want to stress is that I think it's a question we can no longer dodge. Because much of the lower productivity sectors that we are faced with, even if they are no longer directly in the public service realm, are effectively sponsored and sustained by government and by public services in one form or another. So the part of the challenge which me and my team will face over the next few months is to try and gather the best evidence that we can about attempts to answer that question and make sure that we reflect it in the things we do in the industrial strategy.
I look forward to that research.
Thank you.
Luke. Sorry.
Well, throw something on similar lines. As according to the Office of National Statistics, GVA per head is not a measure of productivity. So actually, it would appear that I think as Alan said, we really haven't got a meaningful measure of productivity, and we've probably ought to try and find one.
Sorry, Luke.
Yeah, just really building on the discussion we've had so far, and just to press a little further in terms of, so I suppose industrial strategy is very at home in the frontier economy, in the sort of R&D space and innovation and so on. It's also more at home on the supply side around skills and transport. But really, as you've said, really, we need to dig into the demand side and in the service sector in that long tail of productivity, low productivity firms. But just to sort of press a bit further in terms of what would you like to have from government in order to deliver that locally? Is it appropriate for those things to be exercised locally, or is it an ask for central government to do something different at a national level? Are there other countries, other cities that you look to in terms of what powers do they have, how do they work, how have they improved these situations, or is this are you too early in the process to answer that question?
This being Greater Manchester, we've always got ambitions on this front, haven't we? So you can see, I think, one of the things we're rehearsing with national government at the moment is our argument is that an approach to industrial strategy, because of the narrowing band of activities which you could include as industry in the traditional sense, we have to look much more broadly at things like digital industries, media, and so on, much of which is almost service sector type occupations. In fact, it makes very little sense to talk in terms of services and manufacturing anymore, in a certain sort of sense. Where that's led us to in terms of negotiations with government is trying to think about the ways in which not just we can prove a case in terms of, you know, the particular assets that Greater Manchester has, the particular challenges that it's facing, but how the levers which enable some influence over those things can be better shared. We are not necessarily talking about a pure devolutionary land grab, but we are actively exploring all the time, as you'll know from previous reports, how we can more effectively work together with government and its agencies to deliver the outcomes locally that we would all wish to see. A particular example of that, which we were beginning to flesh out through the local industrial strategy, is around the care sector. So we have, across 10 authorities and across all of the health providers in Greater Manchester, enormous commissioning power in this particular area. We have, you know, we would probably say inside this building delegated responsibility for health and social care, but we can sell it as a devolutionary measure. It goes so far, but that enables you to make the sorts of arguments about a different way in which we can jointly approach some of these low-paid, intractably low-paid, government-supported sectors, and to think about them differently. That's just one example, but I think you can see how it would translate to other things.
Time is moving on, so I'll allow one more question, and that's from Jude.
Thank you. Thanks for the report. It's really interesting. Just a couple of questions on the makeup of the sort of target groups that we're working with. I note this disparity between the kind of women and younger people are more sort of disbenefit from low pay and are sort of are overrepresented. I'm just interested, have you done any analysis on people with disabilities, long-term conditions, and people with caring responsibilities in terms of how they're represented in that?
We can find out for you. So certainly what we've done in terms of inequalities in a more general sense in Greater Manchester is partly through good connections with our academic colleagues, is to look at the breakdown across the groups you mentioned, as broad a breakdown as we possibly can get. We haven't done that specifically in relation to pay as far as I know, but I can go back to the work we've done and get an answer for you on that. The answers won't surprise you, I'm sure. So, you know, the sorts of things we've looked at in terms of inequality are the way in which employment rates differ between different groups along ethnic and gender lines. That makes an enormous difference to pay and to skills and so on. But I can look at it for you. Okay.
Well, thank you for your report. Obviously, we look forward to this being obviously fed into the Task and Finish group. Look forward to their report in due course. Very interesting. I'm glad to hear you say about productivity. It's not easy.
We can continue that discussion.
It's something we need to try and get a grip of going forwards. Yeah. So very interesting. Thank you for the information. And we will note this report, or note the recommendation, I should say. So the next report then is Skills and Employment, a report to Simon Noakes, Executive Director of Policy and Strategy, on the adult education budget, the amendment to the skills funding, and the LGF application skills capital, all three together.
Thank you, Chair. A number of reports. Really, normally we'd obviously do the kind of more regular update for you and bring things through those more regular updates, but a number of things that are coming to a head and timing coming to a head, so wanted to bring things to you today. On the devolution adult education budget, you will remember that the devolution deal signed in 2014 gave us devolved powers over the adult education budget, or promised us that those would come, and those will come to us next year, subject to the relevant orders being passed in Parliament before the summer recess. So we're reliant on that happening in Parliament this summer, and then the powers will come to us in 2019 for the academic year 2019-2020. And in fact, just going back to the previous comment about what more can we do around low pay, obviously a greater control over the skills system and ensuring that people have the skills that they need to progress and advance is a key part of what we believe is important around that whole issue of low pay. So this paper on adult education budget brings you right up to date with where we are in that preparation, if you like, for receiving those devolved powers. And the budget for Greater Manchester, we think, for 1920 is going to be of the order of £92 million. That's slightly higher than it is this year. That doesn't represent an increase in the budget. It represents a difference in the way that people are counted, because at the moment our budget is just for colleges effectively, or providers within Greater Manchester, and we will be getting money for people who are in Greater Manchester in the future. So that doesn't represent a change. As I said, we have to have these orders passed, which allows for the Combined Authority to exercise powers jointly with the Secretary of State around the adult education budget. There's certain things that he will continue, or he or she will continue to do, and certain things that we will do. And our plan in 1920 is to and make minimal change effectively, because we want to make sure the system is stable and that we understand the nature of the system that we're running with a view to then bringing in further changes and more substantial changes in future years. So we're running in this effectively shadow year in 1920 when we will effectively be testing out if we were to pay providers on a different mechanism and if we were to do certain things, what impact would that have on the system as a whole, and then we'll actually introduce those in the following year. A couple of things really to say. Firstly, at the moment the system effectively pays for volumes of learners, and what we want to do is move to a system which pays on progression and outcomes of those learners. So it's actually about learners achieving things that we want to move to a system around, and progression. So it isn't just about achieving jobs. It'll be about, depending on where people are, it'll be about moving progress towards the labour market, or actually getting a job, getting a higher paid job, those sorts of things that we want to try and encourage through the adult education budget. So that will be an important change, and we need to just get that right so we don't kind of disrupt the market too much over a period of time. Two elements that are really important. One is that we are going to be signing a memorandum of understanding with the Department for Education. That will set out, the order effectively just gives us the power to do certain things. The MOU will set out exactly what we can and can't do and how the whole system needs to work. And that will cover things that the department call their readiness conditions. And those were around things like around any financial liabilities that would sit on the combined authority or not. Now, we've been very clear that there are no financial liabilities sitting on the combined authority, except for if a college or a provider were to close, we would have the liability for ensuring that that learner continued to learn effectively. So we have a liability to the learner, not to the institution that potentially was in financial difficulty. There has been some changes to the way that colleges are managed and the way finances in colleges are managed, and there is now the potential that colleges, or obviously private providers have always been able to, but colleges could now actually go into insolvency. But we're very clear that that is not a responsibility, or if that happened, that would not be a responsibility of the combined authority, and that is clear within the arrangements we've got with the department. The second area, so that memorandum of understanding is important in this overall change. The second is effectively around what the government calls readiness, i.e. our readiness to receive the powers that we're going to be given. And that readiness is just wanted to kind of cover 4 or 5 different areas that will cover. First of all, it's about governance. So it's have we got the governance systems that are robust, that enables us to deliver this. And we will be setting up 2 things in that regard. One is a skills advisory panel to make sure that we're getting employers and expert advice about the way in which the whole system, not just the adult education budget, the whole system works. We have a skills and employment partnership at the moment. The skills advisory panel will effectively be a replacement for that, but have certain stronger powers in this devolved world. And as part of that, we will also be developing a post-16 skills plan, which will look at what is it we need to buy effectively, what is it that the conurbation needs, and what do we want the system as a whole to be delivering, not just our element of the system. That panel, that governance, is hugely important that we get that right with the department, because we obviously only control the adult education budget, which is for 19 plus. The department still controls spending on schools and on 16 to 18, and obviously universities are separate in the higher end of the skill spectrum. So actually we're kind of a small player in a very complicated system, and we want to make sure that all the partners in that system are around the table and we're all agreeing what the conurbation needs and what individuals need, and then the whole system is working as one. That's the grand plan which we're trying to pull off. So we need to define, the second area is we need to define what we want to buy. So we actually need to go out to the market and say we want to buy the following things. Now the money actually follows learners, but ultimately we need to be saying to colleges what we believe the conurbation needs, colleges and providers, sorry, what the conurbation needs. Second is we need to put in place financial management around this £92 million that's going to come to us. Broadly, we're going to follow the way the department does it at this point in time, which is that colleges will be grant funded, but independent training providers will have to be procured. So we're going to go through a fairly substantial procurement process for part of this budget. We then need to make sure that we are have the systems in place to manage providers. Once we have it'll be us that has a contract with, or combined authority that has a contract with those providers. We need to ensure we've got provider management arrangements in place, make sure we've got quality management arrangements in place for those providers, and we need to manage this whole thing as a fairly substantial change project within the organisation. And then that finally leads me to the staff resource we are going to need, and we are bringing to put in place the staff resource that we need to make sure this is managed robustly and efficiently and effectively through the combined authority. So, as I say, this was an update, given that the orders will formally be granted, or the consent to us accepting the powers will formally be granted by the combined authority at the end of June, and those powers will probably formally transfer to the combined authority on something like, assuming Parliament does what it needs to in the middle of July. So we just wanted to bring you an update before all of that happened.
Thank you for that, Simon. Just one question before I throw it out to members of the committee for other questions. You mentioned in here about the fact that each constituent local authority will be required to provide consent to this, and that's going to be over a fairly short period of time. How confident are you that all the authorities are geared up for that?
Pretty confident. All the legal officers have been talking. We've had conversations through the wider leadership team, and I believe, and I'm not a legal expert, but I believe that the chief executives have the delegated powers they need to do that in conjunction with the chief legal officers.
Questions? Susan, then Kate.
Thank you. I first want to acknowledge that, of course, Councillor Sean Anstey used to be the leader on this subject, and we met him a few times. And just to highlight that he reminded us that we've never had an outstanding college in Greater Manchester, and also that I remember that he did make it quite clear that he felt that we must always attend to those within the whole skills area and the money that we put towards working well and so on, those who are likely to never work. Okay, now moving on from that, I want to ask, with quite a sort of scrutiny-minded approach to this, about the financial risks to the combined authority. So page 53 talks about those readiness conditions, and the words say they have now largely been resolved. But can officers find a mechanism for scrutiny, perhaps through the chair, where the words do become have been resolved for when the GMCA signs the devolved budget? I feel like this is a really important paper, actually, and so I need to feel that I'm assured. I know that, I think I'm right, this would include detail on what the combined authority put forward as requirements of the DFE and ESFA on which local readiness is contingent. I think I've got that right, haven't I? This would include detail on what the combined authority has put forward as requirements. Not of them, but that relationship with those two bodies. And I do note from the paper, though, it does say this is, even though 3 years steady state funding is there, as regards the 3-year steady state funding to 2022, it presently says that is unable to be confirmed. But we would still be in a position, I feel, as a scrutiny committee where you've said every other matter has been resolved, Simon. Would that be able to be confirmed through Chair and Vice Chair? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I can assure you that the combined authority won't allow us to enter into the or just to receive those devolved powers until those financial risks and issues are fully resolved rather than largely resolved. At the time of writing this paper, there are still minor ongoing discussions between ourselves and the department. We've had letters going backwards and forwards about the last few issues, and those will all be resolved through this memorandum of understanding. I'm not quite sure what the status of the memorandum of understanding will be, but I certainly could share that with the chair to give that reassurance. In terms of the funding, there's two issues. We will not get a firm reassurance from the department that there will be money for this ad infinitum because the department doesn't have that reassurance from Treasury. The requirement is for us to use the money. Technically, the requirement is for us to use the money to make provision to meet those entitlements that learners have. There is no kind of time limit, so it doesn't say, a learner must have been provided with provision within 6 weeks of turning up to that provision. We have to have provision that's available. Now, we had that discussion with the department that basically, if they don't give us the money, we can't then put the provision on, and they completely accept that that's the case. They can't give us any further reassurance because they haven't got it from Treasury.
Just go on from there. I mean, it's the point that I was going to raise. In the Appendix B, in terms of readiness and in terms of commitments from government guaranteeing the funding, it does say in here, these assurances are unlikely to be contained within the orders themselves, but may, that's the word worried me, may form part of the supporting MOU. So Susan's point is a very well-made point that we must, as an authority, a combined authority, ensure that we have got, if you like, the right level of assurances in terms of those guarantees and commitments. So I think, that it's incumbent on us really to make sure that if there's a problem there, that you report it back to us.
I mean, just to be absolutely clear, the orders themselves do not contain any information about finances because the order is literally just passing the power to us, and that's why the MOU has suddenly become so important.
Absolutely, but as I say, the one word that worried me in there, it says it may be included, not will be included.
As working in this sector for an awful long time, I'm just concerned about the mention of European Social Fund in the reports, because obviously, well, not perhaps obviously, but is that element of funding still going to be available to the combined authorities? Because I wouldn't assume it is. It's the background, third paragraph. This includes the opportunity in the future to match GM's devolved AAB with ESF.
European Social Fund will not be available to us after the UK has left the EU, or depending on exactly how we exit the EU. But at the moment, the current programme will run out. Will run its full course. So the current European Social Programme would run up till 2022, but there will be a replacement fund called the UK Shared Prosperity Fund that will still be designed, but it will effectively do similar kinds of things. Just to be clear, we're not dependent on European Social Fund to deliver our statutory responsibilities, because that European funding could never have been used in that way anyway. European funding has always been used to provide additional value into the skills system, and we are hopeful that there will be something there, but if there isn't, we would fall back to delivering our statutory responsibilities.
And would that still be on a match fund type basis for that new budget?
We don't know yet.
Right.
We don't know.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned about still working through the governance arrangements, so I don't know how well you'll be able to answer this at the moment, but I'm just thinking in terms of the individual colleges, their governance arrangements as they are, would they be affected at all? Would their powers and responsibilities remain the same as they are, or would they be affected by the overarching governance of the whole sector within Greater Manchester? Thank you.
There'll be no change to the governance of colleges. The only thing from a college perspective is that they will have a contract with the combined authority, as well as having a contract with the Department for Education, because at the moment they have a contract with the DFE, obviously both for their 16 to 18 and for their 19 plus provision. Their 19 plus provision will be funded via a contract with technically a grant funding agreement for a college, a grant funding agreement with the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and their 16 to 18 funding will continue to come from DFE, but there'll be no change to their individual governance.
Charles.
Thanks. It's just that where we've got learners who come from outside of GM in colleges, now it happens more around the edges, but it seems to be quite prevalent where I'm from. Will it cause a big problem? Is it just an administrative problem for the individual colleges?
we're working through all of those issues at the moment. We don't believe it's going to cause a major problem. There's probably one or possibly two colleges which have large numbers that might be affected. In the main, it is GM learners who are going to colleges outside of GM, where we have quite a few learners going to some of the colleges in St Helens, for example. And we're just trying to work through where there's the odd one or two learner, it won't cause any problems at all. If it's substantial volumes, we're looking at those arrangements with those individual colleges.
One final question, that's from Clive.
AKA. It seems to me that over the years, the aims of adult education have narrowed. And then within the report, we get the idea that the aims of adult education is work readiness or work preparation. Is there going to be ever room for learning for pleasure?
You're absolutely right. The aims of adult education have narrowed very substantially. I mean, originally, it actually wasn't. There used to be a number of different budgets. One was community learning, and then there was a separate budget around adult learning. The original purpose of the adult education budget was about training people in the skills that employers needed. That was the whole original purpose. Actually, what it's ended up doing is funding an awful lot of level 2 to GCSE level English and maths courses, or GCSE courses, so level 2 courses, which include English and maths, I should say, because, as we all know, that 40% or the may not be quite the right number, but something of that order of our young people come out of our schools without GCSE English and maths, or 5 qualifications, including those. So actually, colleges are picking up quite a lot of that activity, which is actually preparing people for the basics before they go on. Now, originally, the adult education, but it was supposed to be about those high-level skills that employers needed. So we've seen a narrowing in that sense, and also the community education budget has been put into it. So actually, the vast majority of the adult education budget is now used meeting statutory entitlements. So we hope that actually, the more we have look at the school system as a whole, the more we can get young people getting the skills they need through the school system, the more we can release money in the adult education budget to actually do some of the things that we would be wanting to do with it, and better meeting employers' needs, some of the higher level skills that will then drive some of the productivity issues that we were just talking about earlier. Yeah, I'll just keep this very brief, Chair. I mean, this is hopefully very simple. We have 2 contracts, youth contract expansion and the apprenticeship grant for employers. There were 2 chunks of activity that we were delivering under contract to DFE. Both of those contracts have delivered what they were expected to deliver, but they were delivered under budget effectively. So we have money, spare is the wrong word, but we have money left available from those 2 contracts. We have approached the department, and they have agreed that we can keep that money as long as we use it for the purposes for which it was originally intended, i.e. For activity related to youth contract extension and activity related to apprenticeships. In relation to the youth contract extension, the grant was 5.8 million, and we've got about just shy of 2 million left, and we're proposing that we use a large chunk of that to support the work and health programme. So that's about getting young people and skills that they need in the work and health programme. And that we then use the rest on targeted initiatives to support NEET and youth unemployment. And then in relation to the apprenticeship grant for employers, we've got about 1.7 million left. It has to be spent on apprenticeships, and it has to be spent by March 19, and that we're proposing to effectively devise and then commission activity to support SMEs in growing and developing their apprenticeships, particularly linked to obviously the decline in apprenticeship starts. We think that's an important use of the money. So it's really just to, this is going through to the Combined Authority, but it's just for you to note and give any views in its process through to the Combined Authority.
Any questions? Tanya.
Thank you, Chair. money left available is not something we often hear, so that's good news. I was just wondering, the money that's left specifically for apprenticeships and the like, how are the 10 authorities made aware that this money is available? Because there might be some projects that are being set up and that need this money, and this money is left over, so to speak. How do we bridge the two? Is there a strategy for that at the moment?
Gemma couldn't be here today, and she would know the exact details of the answer to that question, but we're working with all of the skills leads in each of the 10 authorities, and obviously this will be going through to the combined authority, where all the leaders will have a view on this, and we would work with the 10 authorities in terms of those, that devising and commissioning of activity. So all of the 10 authorities will be fully involved in that process.
I've got a question, actually. I mean, normally, I suppose, if we save money, it's good news. But on this occasion, the fact that we've saved money, particularly on the apprentice schemes, does that indicate that we've not been, if you like, we haven't been challenging enough to employers to try and actually ensure that they can use this money for improving the level of apprenticeships within their organisations? Because it just strikes me that you know, it's good news that obviously we got the money for next year, but should we have done better this year?
On the apprenticeship levy monies, we met all of the targets that we had been, or that we agreed with the department. So all of those targets were met, but we achieved that. And the reason we achieved it for lower, I mean, it's partly for the reason you say. We put quite a lot of money aside to support employers taking on higher level apprenticeships. So we had an overall volume of apprenticeships we were trying to support, but we'd said we wanted more of those to be at higher levels, and we'd retained some money for that. So we achieved the overall numbers, but more of them were at slightly lower level than we had planned. So it's a mixed bag in that sense. Good that we got the numbers that we wanted last year. We would have ideally liked more to be at high levels, and which is why we've got the money left to spend.
And finally, Simon, the skills capital.
Yeah, again, just an update. Obviously, this is part of a procurement process, which you've seen the kind of criteria around. Just wanted to bring you a very quick update. You'll remember we talked about the we had a previous very old skills capital program. In the new skills capital program, as we call it, there's £71 million to be spent or allocated through the local growth fund. We previously talked to you about the Stockport Trafford merger that has been approved at £16 million, and then the other projects that were running through the round one expressions of interest was Bury College and Tameside College. Both of those were approved by the combined authority last cycle. So for Bury College for 2.2 million and Tameside for 3.3 million. The rest of the projects went through a round two process. So quite a few people applied in round one. Most of them weren't ready to go in round one, as we decided through the appraisal process. So they were encouraged to reapply, and others reapplied as well in round two. We have had 9 expressions of interest through the round two skills capital programme. It actually says 5 were successful. I think it's actually 6 to be fair. 6 were progressing to stage 2. 2 were revised that we were on reserve if we had any money left, and 1 was rejected through that initial expression of interest phase. Those 6 are now working up to full bid phase, and those full bids will come forward in July, then be appraised during August, and hopefully be able to make decisions in September. We've got £44 million of the original budget left. We believe that the projects that we're progressing to full bid stage in round 2 will give us, together with the projects we've already funded, will give us a good coverage of sectors, skill levels and geography in terms of high quality provision across the conurbation, and we believe, we don't know yet because obviously it'll depend on exactly how those full business cases come back, but we believe that those 6 projects would effectively spend all of that £44 million, but that's obviously still subject to procurement process.
Any questions? technical issues the ratio, then the next report on skills and employment isn't due back to this committee until November time. But clearly a decision will be made on this funding before then, according to the timetable. So presumably we'll have a separate report to come back to this committee to update us on the bidding process nearer the time.
Yes, I can do that. That's not a problem. Obviously, it's a procurement process, so there's very little flexibility for the committee to input into that. I.e., we've set the rules, which is where you were involved, and we've gone through the process, and that will lead to an outcome. But happy to bring back a report on the outcome.
Thank you. So the last thing on the agenda, apart from the minutes, which we'll do at the end, is the work programme. So Susan.
Right, for those members of the committee last year, you agreed to programme a series of update reports which would ensure that the committee were able to review the kind of breadth of, this committee's remit is enormous. And to ensure that you had good coverage of all your topics, it was agreed that you would receive a series of update reports that would, most importantly, be tailored across all the major areas of the Greater Manchester strategy from the point of view of this committee's remit, but also focus on areas that the committee were interested in. So we found that, I think, last year's update on skills and employment worked incredibly well. You received a cluster of reports to do with skills and employment, and there was real synergy and, energies that resultant from that timetabling of reports. So got a couple of suggestions, just mindful of the kind of mindful of the time now. I wonder whether or not it would be really helpful if we could spend perhaps half an hour or so before next month's meeting, just sort of going into the work programme and enabling you to get to grips with things a little bit, particularly for those members who haven't been previously on the committee. I thought that might be helpful. But also to suggest about whether or not there was any particular issues on the two updates that you're going to be receiving on internationalisation and Brexit, whether there are any aspects of that the committee were particularly interested in and wanted officers to focus upon, because obviously, the committee is still in control of their own work programme. So.
What I would add to that as well is that we've got a couple of things we've identified that we want to come back to the committee. That was work of the growth company, the local enterprise partnership, and the Graphene Institute. So we need to fill those into the gaps. And also, I'm very keen, as I've already mentioned to Susan, as soon as possible that the Mayor comes to one of our committee's meetings, to, if you like, so we can debate with him some of the key issues going forwards. Now, it may be, as we did last time when he came, which was on the strategy's 6-month update on the Northern Powerhouse, but that's a bit late in the year, it's October time. I would frankly rather see him earlier than that. So even though it's more of a general debate and a scrutiny discussion. So I'll leave that with Susan in terms of getting some dates free from the Mayor. Are you happy with that? Susan?
Just one thing to add, because you mentioned three, do you remember you just mentioned 3 topics as if you were batting it early there for the next time's half-hour discussion. That I think, are you suggesting you'll ask us to possibly come at 1:30 next time for... Yes. Yeah, sorry, okay. Well, I just want to get it in because I did send it around on email, and I think I'm only looking anyway at, say, February 2019 now, but this will have to form part of next time's half-hour discussion. And possibly then even June 2019, because it looks like anything to do with employment. So 16 November does look full, okay, and that's where employment features. I've gone through and looked at where employment features because the one thing that I sent round on email that seemed really interesting was that an organisation has been in Greater Manchester and it's held some events and it's done quite a bit of discussion work with women about, Chairman remembers, about the whole business of workforce, women's voices in devolution, particularly about work and the employment sector, and the important business of childcare, and also their access to skills. And I read the detail of what the Fawcett Society has been doing, and I thought, I'd really like to hear about that. If they've got information that's going to be useful, and it would be different because it would be about inviting a different organisation to come to see us. But, I know they're headquartered in London. I know some new members haven't seen that email, but they're in, you know, they're in Manchester by the sounds of it, doing things. So I thought I'd highlighted, it was easier to highlight two areas on the timetable where employment features anyway. So those are the two I'd suggested, but that would be something for officers to work with if members end up agreeing that an invitation to them might be useful.
I have to admit, actually, I read that email and thought it was a great idea, but I didn't respond. I don't know why, actually, a hands up job. So I think, yes, we should work with that and try and get some sort of presentation to the committee. Luke.
I very much agree with the points being made, and on that, in that vein, there are a lot of people who can talk to these items who are not employees of the Combined Authority, and actually our Economy Committee in Manchester works quite well in sort of inviting academics sometimes or campaigners and so on in to sort of broaden the discussion a bit. So I think we should certainly consider doing that. The other thing is within that skills item in November, I wonder if we'd be able to have the Work and Health Programme providers themselves into that meeting, if that is possible. That's something that our Economy Committee did. It can be very challenging for them, I think, to put it mildly, but we are contracting these organisations, we're co-commissioning them to deliver services for the most deprived people in the city, so I think that's a legitimate request of them.
As we're conducting the half an hour now, could I just suggest, in view of Tim's presentation, I mean, we're talking of £1 billion spend on the airport, which I think is due for completion in 2020. Could we put an item as far back late into the 2019 as possible to get a report on progress, because we would be within months of supposedly completion?
Good idea.
Just quickly to mention the Graphene Institute. I was at the presentation when it was first invented by the Russian professors, and they were saying that Cambridge straight away offered them to go down. They would fund them and help them to continue their research. And they said, no, we are committed to the north. And I believe it is paramount for us to utilise this great asset that we've got.
We have, actually, as a committee last year, we had a presentation from them, an excellent presentation.
I just saw the update. We need updates.
Which is why it's there. It's an update, really. So,
Update, yeah.
And yeah, well, we support them. Anything else? Right. Okay, thank you. Thank you for attending the meeting, particularly the substitute members. I mean, it really is, you know, we really appreciate the fact that you're coming to substitute members. And without you, we wouldn't have been quorate today, in fact, just. So that's good. Some excellent questions. I'm sure that we'll develop as a team going forward, you know, over this coming year. And look forward to your attendance at the next meeting. Cheers.